Ma'am, step away from the property right now. The voice cut through the cold Texas night before Naomi Carter even had time to close her car door. Red and blue lights flashed across the wet pavement, washing over the quiet suburban street like a warning nobody else wanted to hear. Naomi froze with one hand still holding her hospital lunch bag and the other gripping her car keys tight enough to leave marks in her palm. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a 14-hour ICU shift, and the exhaustion behind her eyes made the bright police lights feel even harsher. A light rain had started falling 10 minutes earlier, just enough to leave the sidewalks shining under the street lamps. Officer Grant Holloway stood beside his patrol SUV with one hand resting near his belt, his broad frame blocking the narrow walkway leading to Naomi's front porch. He looked at her house, then back at her, like the two things didn't belong together. "I said step away from the property," he repeated slowly, his voice calm in the kind of way that felt colder than yelling. Naomi blinked in disbelief. "This is my house." Holloway tilted his head slightly, unconvinced. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood." Naomi let out a quiet breath through her nose, trying to stay composed. Across the street, curtains shifted. A porch light clicked on. Somebody was watching. She hated that feeling more than anything. After years of working night shifts, Naomi had learned how to ignore stares at gas stations, suspicious glances in grocery store parking lots, and the uncomfortable silence that sometimes followed her into elevators. But this was different. This was her street, her driveway, her mailbox standing 10 feet away with Carter printed clearly across the front in faded black letters. The rain collected along the edges of her braids and rolled down the side of her face as she slowly reached into her scrub pocket for her keys. Holloway's posture changed instantly. "Don't make sudden movements." Naomi stopped moving altogether. The words hit harder than she expected. Her heartbeat became loud in her ears. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly across the sky. She looked down at herself for a second. Gray scrubs, hospital ID badge, white sneakers stained from disinfectant, and long hallways. She looked exactly like what she was, a tired nurse trying to get home after taking care of strangers all day. But under the spinning police lights, none of that seemed to matter. Holloway stepped closer, rain tapping against the shoulders of his uniform. "Whose car is this?" "Mine." "You got ID?" Naomi swallowed the frustration building in her throat. "It's inside my purse." "Where's the purse?" "Front seat." Holloway glanced into the vehicle, then back at her. "Stay where you are." The words sounded less like instructions and more like ownership. Naomi's fingers trembled slightly from fatigue as she stood there in silence. The neighborhood around her remained still except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the crackling radio attached to Holloway's shoulder. One house farther down the street slowly opened its blinds. Another porch light flicked on. Naomi felt every pair of unseen eyes settling onto her skin. Then, from somewhere across the street, a deep, low growl broke the silence. The growl was low and steady, the kind of sound that immediately changed the air without anyone raising their voice. Officer Holloway turned toward the dark sidewalk across the street as a large German shepherd slowly emerged from the shadows beside a tall man in a dark rain jacket. The dog did not bark. It simply watched. Naomi felt her chest loosen slightly for the first time since the police lights had appeared behind her car. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her curls onto her hospital badge while she tried to steady her breathing. The past 14 hours had already drained every ounce of energy from her body before this night had even started. Earlier that morning, she had walked into St. Mary's Medical Center at 6:30 with a cup of gas station coffee and sore feet from the shift before. By noon, she had helped comfort a frightened elderly patient whose family could not make it in time. Around 4 in the afternoon, she sat on the edge of a hallway chair for less than 3 minutes just to eat half of a turkey sandwich before another. Emergency pulled her back onto the intensive care floor. She spent the rest of the evening moving between rooms filled with heart monitors, oxygen machines, and exhausted families holding onto hope with trembling hands. Naomi had always believed people deserve kindness on the worst days of their lives. It was the reason she became a nurse after watching her own mother slowly disappear inside a hospital room 3 years earlier. Cancer had taken nearly everything from her mother except her softness. Even in pain, she used to tell Naomi, "Do not let hard people make your heart hard too." Naomi carried those words with her every single day. The silver necklace resting beneath her scrubs still held her mother's tiny cross pendant against her skin. Tonight, all Naomi wanted was a hot shower, silence, and maybe 4 hours of sleep before doing it all over again. Instead, she stood soaked in the middle of her own driveway while strangers watched from behind curtains. Holloway kept his eyes on the man across the street. "Call your dog back," he said firmly. The stranger did not answer right away. He rested one calm hand on the dog's back, while rain tapped softly against the hood of his jacket. Naomi noticed how controlled both of them seemed. The dog remained perfectly still beside him, alert but disciplined. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime rattled gently in the rain. Naomi shifted her weight, her legs aching from standing all day inside hospital corridors. Her lunch bag suddenly slipped from her tired fingers and hit the wet concrete with a soft thud. A plastic container cracked open, sending cold mashed potatoes and green beans across the driveway. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. Something about seeing her dinner spilled onto the pavement almost hurt more than the embarrassment itself. She had spent all day caring for people she did not know, only to come home and feel like a criminal in front of her own house. One neighbor quietly stepped onto a porch holding a coffee mug, pretending not to stare. Another phone screen glowed faintly through a window. Naomi bent slowly to pick up the broken container, but Holloway lifted a hand immediately. "Leave it there. For now." His voice remained cold and procedural, as if humanity itself had become an inconvenience. Naomi swallowed hard and straightened back up, rainwater sliding down her face, while the German shepherd continued watching silently from across the street beside the mysterious man who still had not looked away from her. Officer Grant Holloway had spent nearly 18 years wearing a badge, and somewhere along the way he had stopped seeing fear in people's eyes as a warning sign. To him, it had become proof that he was in control. Rain slid down the hood of his patrol vehicle, while dispatch chatter crackled softly from the radio attached to his shoulder. He barely seemed to notice the cold anymore. The neighborhood around him was one of the quietest in the county, filled with trimmed lawns, stone mailboxes, and expensive pickup trucks parked beneath covered driveways. People here liked predictability. They liked routines, security cameras, and neighbors who looked familiar. Holloway believed it was his job to protect that comfort at all costs, even if it meant treating certain people like questions before they had the chance to become answers. He looked back at Naomi Carter standing under the flashing lights with rainwater soaking through her gray scrubs. She looked exhausted, but Holloway had trained himself not to respond to emotion. In his mind, sympathy clouded judgment. Procedure mattered more. "Do not pick anything up yet," he said as Naomi glanced toward the spilled food on the driveway. Her shoulders dropped slightly at the sound of his voice. The German shepherd across the street remained perfectly still beside the tall stranger in the dark jacket. Holloway noticed the man now, really noticed him for the first time. Calm posture, broad shoulders, older, maybe mid-40s. The kind of quiet confidence that did not need attention to feel powerful. Holloway did not like that kind of presence during a stop. It shifted the atmosphere in ways he could not fully control. "Sir," Holloway called out across the rain, "I need you to stay back with the dog." The man nodded once, but did not move away. Naomi wrapped her arms tightly around herself against the cold wind drifting through the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, a sprinkler system clicked on automatically, sending water across an already soaked lawn. The ordinary suburban sound made the moment feel even stranger. Holloway glanced again at the house behind Naomi. Large front windows, white shutters, fresh flower beds lining the walkway. It did not match the image he had formed in his head when dispatch described a suspicious person sitting in a parked car outside the residence. A suspicious person. That was all it took sometimes. One nervous phone call, one uncomfortable neighbor, one assumption carried through a police radio into the middle of somebody else's life. Holloway had responded to hundreds of calls like this over the years. Most ended quickly. A warning, a check of identification, a few tense minutes before everyone went home. But tonight something felt different, though he could not explain why. Maybe it was the way Naomi kept trying to hold on to her dignity instead of arguing. Maybe it was the silence from the stranger across the street. Or maybe it was the dog, standing there with disciplined stillness while rain darkened its thick fur. Holloway shifted his stance and looked directly at Naomi again. "You said this is your house. How long have you lived here?" "Almost 2 years," Naomi answered quietly. And you live alone? The question lingered in the cold air longer than it should have. Naomi hesitated before answering. Yes. Holloway studied her face carefully, searching for uncertainty, but all he saw was exhaustion. Deep exhaustion. The kind that came from carrying too much for too long. Still, he held on to his suspicion because suspicion had become easier for him than trust. Another porch light flicked on farther down the street. Holloway could feel the attention building around them now. The entire block was slowly waking up to the scene unfolding beneath the flashing lights. Then the stranger across the street finally stepped forward, one slow step into the rain, and the German shepherd moved with him in complete silence. The man crossed the street without rushing, his boots splashing softly through shallow rainwater gathering along the curb, while the German shepherd stayed perfectly beside him. Naomi watched carefully, still hugging her arms against the cold. Under the flashing patrol lights, she could finally see the stranger more clearly now. He looked older than she first thought, maybe somewhere in his 40s, with short dark hair touched by gray at the edges and the kind of posture that came from years of discipline instead of intimidation. The dog moved with quiet precision beside him, focused but calm, its dark coat glistening under the rain. Officer Holloway straightened immediately as the man approached. "Sir, I need you to stay on your property," Holloway said. The stranger stopped a few feet away from Naomi without showing any sign of fear or aggression. "I live right there," he answered calmly, nodding toward the brick house across the street. His voice was deep but controlled, steady enough to cut through the tension without raising volume. The German shepherd sat beside him automatically, never taking its eyes off Holloway. Naomi noticed that detail immediately. This was not somebody showing off a dangerous dog. This was training. Serious training. Holloway glanced down at the animal before looking back at the man. "Then I suggest you go back inside while I finish conducting my investigation." The stranger studied Naomi for a brief moment. Her soaked scrubs, the broken food container near her feet, the trembling exhaustion she was trying hard to hide. Rain slid from the edge of his jacket as he spoke again. "She looks tired, officer." Holloway's jaw tightened slightly. "This does not concern you." "Maybe not," the man replied evenly. "But she said she lives here." Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, embarrassed by how visible her exhaustion had become. The entire street now felt like a stage she never agreed to stand on. More windows glowed softly in nearby houses. A couple stood behind a curtain farther down the block, pretending not to watch. Naomi hated how familiar this feeling was becoming in America. Always explaining, always proving, always trying to appear non-threatening while simply existing. Holloway stepped closer toward Naomi again. "Ma'am, I still need identification." Naomi nodded carefully. "My purse is still inside the car." "Then retrieve it slowly." Naomi moved toward the driver's side door with stiff muscles and aching knees. Every movement suddenly felt heavy beneath Holloway's stare. She opened the door carefully and reached for her purse from the passenger seat. As she turned back around, her mother's small framed photograph slipped from the side pocket and fell onto the wet driveway beside the spilled food. The glass cracked softly on impact. Naomi froze instantly. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared down at the photograph lying in rainwater. It was the last printed picture she had of her mother before chemotherapy took her smile away. Without thinking, Naomi bent quickly to grab it. Holloway reacted immediately. "Ma'am, stop right there." The sharpness in his voice cut through the rain. Naomi slowly straightened again, leaving the broken frame on the pavement while humiliation burned behind her eyes. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the stranger finally stepped forward without asking permission. The German shepherd rose smoothly beside him. Holloway's posture stiffened. "Sir." But the man ignored the warning completely. He crouched calmly beside the cracked photograph, picked it up carefully with one hand, and wiped rainwater from the glass using the sleeve of his jacket. Naomi watched silently as he studied the smiling woman in the picture for one quiet second before looking back up at her. "Your mother?" Naomi swallowed hard and nodded once. The stranger looked at the cracked frame again, then at Officer Holloway standing beneath the flashing lights. His expression changed almost invisibly. Not anger. Something colder. Disappointment. The rain kept falling in slow, steady lines while Naomi stared at the cracked photograph, trembling lightly in the stranger's hand. Her mother's smile was still visible behind the broken glass, soft and warm even beneath the flashing police lights. The stranger held the frame carefully, almost respectfully, before offering it back to her. Naomi accepted it with both hands like something fragile enough to disappear completely if she moved too fast. Officer Holloway watched the exchange with growing impatience. The entire situation was slipping away from the clean control he preferred. More neighbors had gathered behind windows now. A garage door farther down the street slowly lifted halfway before stopping. Somebody else stood there watching from the shadows beside a parked SUV. Holloway adjusted his stance and glanced toward the stranger again. "I need you to step back," he said firmly. "Now." The stranger did not react emotionally. He simply rested one hand on the German Shepherd's collar while rainwater dripped from his sleeve onto the sidewalk. "She already told you she lives here." Holloway's eyes narrowed slightly. "And I am still conducting an investigation." Naomi felt her stomach tighten. Investigation. The words sounded so official, so heavy. Yet all she had done was come home from work. She clutched the broken photograph against her chest and finally spoke again, her voice tired but steady. "Officer, my identification is in my wallet. My address is on it." Holloway looked at her for a long second before nodding once. Slowly, Naomi reached into her purse carefully and pulled out her wallet with stiff fingers. The rain had started soaking through the fabric of her scrubs completely now, leaving her cold down to the bone. She handed over her driver's license while Holloway studied every movement like suspicion itself had become instinct. The German Shepherd remained perfectly silent beside the stranger, but its attention never drifted. Holloway examined Naomi's license beneath the patrol lights. The address matched the house directly behind her. For a brief second, uncertainty crossed his face. But pride arrived faster. "How long did you say you lived here?" he asked again. "Almost 2 years." Holloway looked toward the house, then back at Naomi. "Who else has access to the property?" Naomi blinked slowly, exhausted by the endless questions. "Nobody." "Any recent issues with neighbors?" "No." The stranger finally spoke again, calm as ever. "Officer, she just finished a hospital shift." Holloway turned sharply toward him. "Sir, unless you are directly involved, I need you to stop interfering." The rain intensified slightly, tapping harder against the patrol SUV and nearby rooftops. Naomi could feel her legs beginning to ache from standing so long after an entire day on her feet. She glanced down at the spilled food still spread across the driveway beside the rain-soaked photograph case. The humiliation of it all settled deeper inside her chest. She wondered how many people on the street would remember this scene tomorrow morning. The police lights. The questions. The black woman being treated like she did not belong in her own neighborhood. Holloway handed back her license but did not apologize. Instead, he looked around at the watching houses as though searching for justification inside the eyes of strangers. Then his radio crackled loudly against his shoulder. "Unit 12, status check." Holloway pressed the button immediately. "Everything is under control." But the words no longer sounded convincing. The stranger took one quiet step closer, enough for the patrol lights to finally illuminate his face fully. Naomi noticed something then that she had missed before. A faded scar near his jawline. Another along one hand resting calmly against the dog's collar. The kind of marks left by years Naomi could not imagine. Holloway noticed them too. For the first time since arriving, the officer seemed uncertain about the man standing in front of him. The stranger looked directly at Naomi before speaking softly. "You should not have had to prove you belong at your own front door." The words settled into the rainy silence heavier than anything else said all night. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The rain softened into a fine mist drifting through the yellow glow of the streetlights, while Officer Holloway stood motionless beside his patrol SUV. Naomi could hear the quiet hiss of water running along the curb and the faint hum of electricity from the overhead power lines. The neighborhood had fallen strangely silent now, as if even the people watching behind their windows understood something important had shifted. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the cracked photograph in her hands. A thin line of water slid across the broken glass directly over her mother's smile. She gently wiped it away with the sleeve of her scrub top, careful not to smear the image beneath. Her fingers shook from exhaustion more than cold. The stranger and the German Shepherd remained beside her without crowding her space. That alone felt unusual. Most people either ignored discomfort or tried to dominate it. This man simply stood near it quietly, like someone who understood pain did not always need noise. Holloway cleared his throat at last, but the confidence from earlier had faded around the edges. "Nobody is accusing anyone of anything," he said, though the sentence sounded weaker than before. Naomi stared at the wet pavement for a moment before answering softly. "Then why did it feel like I had to defend myself the second I got out of my car?" Holloway opened his mouth slightly, but no words came out immediately. The rain continued tapping against the hood of the patrol vehicle in uneven rhythms. Somewhere farther down the street, a television flickered blue through an open curtain. Naomi slowly exhaled, the breath leaving her like she had been holding it for hours instead of minutes. "I work at St. Mary's," she continued quietly. "I spent all day helping people breathe easier. I spent all day trying to comfort families who were terrified. And tonight, I came home scared to walk to my own front door." Her voice never rose. That made it heavier somehow. Holloway looked away briefly toward the houses lining the street. For the first time all night, Naomi noticed uncertainty settling into his face instead of authority. The stranger glanced toward her with calm understanding, but still said nothing. The German Shepherd finally lowered itself onto the wet pavement beside him, resting silently while rain darkened the fur along its back. Naomi looked at the dog for a second and felt something inside her loosen. Animals never cared about appearances the way people did. They sensed fear, kindness, calm, intentions, nothing else. The stranger reached into his jacket pocket slowly and pulled out a folded handkerchief before offering it to Naomi. "For the frame," he said simply. Naomi accepted it with a small nod. The cloth smelled faintly like cedar and rain. She carefully wrapped the cracked photograph while trying to ignore the embarrassment still burning beneath her skin. Holloway shifted his weight again. His radio crackled once more with distant dispatch traffic, but he ignored it this time. The flashing red and blue lights reflected across the rainwater pooling near Naomi's shoes, turning the entire driveway into trembling colors. "You said your mother passed away?" the stranger asked gently after a moment. Naomi nodded once. 3 years ago. "Cancer?" Naomi looked surprised. "Yes." The stranger glanced at the photograph in her hands. "My wife, too." Silence returned again, deeper this time. Not hostile. Human. Holloway remained still beneath the rain while the words settled into the night around all three of them. Naomi looked toward the stranger more carefully now. Beneath the calm expression and steady posture, there was grief there too. Old grief. Carried quietly. The kind that changed how someone moved through the world forever. Then the stranger finally lifted his eyes toward Holloway and spoke in the same calm voice he had used all night. "Some people come home carrying enough already, officer. They should not have to carry suspicion too." Officer Holloway looked down at the wet pavement for a brief moment after the stranger spoke, as though the rain itself had suddenly become louder than the flashing lights behind him. Naomi stood quietly beside the mailbox with the wrapped photograph pressed carefully against her chest while cold wind drifted through the street. The German Shepherd remained lying beside the stranger, calm and disciplined despite the tension hanging in the air. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, softer now. Holloway finally lifted his eyes toward the stranger. "You seem very interested in this situation," he said cautiously. The man glanced once toward Naomi before answering. "I am interested when somebody is treated unfairly." Holloway studied him more carefully now. The confidence, the composure, the way he spoke without trying to impress anyone. Something about him felt familiar, though Holloway could not place it yet. "What exactly do you do, sir?" Holloway asked. The stranger gave a faint, almost tired smile. "These days, mostly yard work and dog training." Naomi noticed the answer was intentional, not dishonest, just incomplete. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the patrol SUV while silence settled again between them. Then the German Shepherd suddenly stood and moved closer to Naomi, gently pressing against her leg for warmth. Naomi looked down in surprise. The dog's calm presence felt strangely comforting after everything that had happened tonight. The stranger rested one hand lightly on the leash. "Titan does not usually trust people quickly," he said softly. Naomi managed the smallest smile of the night. "Maybe he can tell I had a rough day." "Maybe," the stranger replied. Holloway crossed his arms tightly against the rain. "What is your name, sir?" The man looked directly at him for the first time since stepping into the driveway. "Marcus Reed." Something changed instantly in Holloway's expression. Small at first, almost invisible. Then his eyes narrowed slightly as recognition slowly surfaced beneath the tension. Marcus Reed, he repeated quietly. Naomi glanced between them, confused by the sudden shift in tone. Holloway stared harder now, piecing things together. The posture, the scars, the dog. Then his eyes moved toward the old black pickup truck parked across the street beneath the porch light. A military decal sat faded on the rear window. Holloway looked back at Marcus again. Wait, he said slowly. Reed as in Senior Chief Marcus Reed? Marcus remained calm. I retired a while ago. Naomi saw Holloway's entire posture change. The stiffness in his shoulders faded slightly. Even his voice sounded different now, less commanding and more uncertain. You were Navy, Holloway said carefully. Marcus nodded once. 22 years. Holloway looked stunned for a brief second before glancing at Titan again. And the dog. Retired military working dog. Naomi blinked softly. Suddenly, everything about the man made sense. The discipline. The silence. The way he observed everything without escalating the situation. Holloway rubbed rainwater from the back of his neck, visibly uncomfortable now. I think I have heard your name. Before, he admitted quietly. Marcus shrugged lightly. That is not important. But it clearly was important to Holloway. Naomi watched the officer's confidence unravel piece by piece beneath the rain. Holloway shifted again before speaking carefully. You served overseas? Marcus looked toward the dark street for a moment before answering. Long enough. His tone carried no pride. Only distance. The kind built from memories too heavy to display casually. Titan stayed pressed beside Naomi's leg while the rain softened around them. Holloway suddenly seemed aware of how this entire scene must look now. A tired nurse standing in soaked scrubs outside her own home while neighbors watched from windows. A decorated veteran quietly defending her dignity without raising his voice once. The realization settled visibly across Holloway's face. Then Marcus reached slowly into his jacket pocket and removed an old worn leather wallet. He opened it calmly and held up a weathered military identification card beneath the patrol lights. Holloway stared at it silently, while rainwater rolled down the edge of the badge clipped beside Marcus's retired Navy credentials. The street fell completely still. Officer Holloway stared at the identification card in Marcus Reed's hand while rainwater slid across the plastic surface beneath the flashing patrol lights. The Old Navy insignia caught the light for only a second before Marcus lowered the wallet again and slipped it calmly back into his jacket pocket. He did not display it proudly. He did not use it like a threat. That seemed to affect Holloway more than anything else. Naomi watched the officer carefully now. The sharp authority that had controlled the street earlier was gone. In its place stood a man suddenly aware that everyone watching this scene would remember it very differently than he intended. Holloway looked toward Naomi again. Her soaked scrubs clung heavily to her arms from the rain. Dark circles rested beneath tired eyes that had probably spent the entire day comforting strangers. The cracked photograph remained wrapped carefully inside the handkerchief Marcus had given her. Titan stood quietly beside her like a silent witness to everything. Holloway exhaled slowly through his nose before finally speaking. Miss Carter, he said, his voice lower now. I was responding to a call from a concerned resident. Naomi nodded faintly, though the explanation did not erase what she had felt standing outside her own home beneath police lights. I understand that, she answered softly. But you never looked at me like I belonged here. Holloway did not respond immediately. Rain tapped steadily against the roof of the patrol SUV while distant thunder faded farther across the county. One of the watching neighbors quietly stepped back from their window and closed the curtain. Another porch light switched off. The neighborhood itself almost seemed embarrassed now. Marcus remained silent beside Naomi, giving her space to speak for herself. That mattered to her more than she expected. He had not taken over the moment. He had simply stood beside her long enough for the truth to breathe. Holloway rubbed a hand across his jaw slowly. That was not my intention. Naomi looked directly at him for the first time since the stop began. Maybe not, she said quietly. But it was still what happened. The honesty in her voice landed harder than anger would have. Holloway lowered his eyes briefly. He looked older suddenly, more tired, like somebody forced to confront a version of himself he had spent years avoiding. Marcus finally spoke again, calm as ever. Intentions matter less than impact sometimes. Holloway gave a small nod, though it looked painful for him to do it. The patrol lights continued spinning red and blue reflections across the rainwater pooling along the curb. Naomi could hear Titan breathing softly beside her. The dog stayed perfectly calm, completely at ease next to her now. Holloway glanced toward Marcus. "I appreciate your service," he said quietly after a moment. Marcus looked toward the dark street, instead of accepting the compliment directly. "Then protect people when they are standing right in front of you." The sentence settled heavily into the night air. Holloway swallowed hard. Naomi noticed his hands no longer rested near his belt. His posture had softened completely. For the first time all evening, he looked less like an officer managing a situation and more like a man realizing he had hurt someone unnecessarily. Holloway looked back at Naomi again. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I am sorry for how this unfolded tonight." Naomi remained silent for a moment. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of her sleeves onto the driveway. She was still cold, still exhausted, still embarrassed. But beneath all of that, she could finally hear sincerity in his voice. Holloway continued quietly. "You should have been able to come home in peace." Naomi looked down at the wrapped photograph in her hands before answering. "I just wanted to walk through my front door without being afraid." Holloway closed his eyes briefly at those words. Somewhere overhead, the rain finally began to lighten. Marcus rested one hand gently against Titan's neck while the neighborhood slowly returned to silence around them. The rain slowed to a light drizzle as Officer Holloway finally reached up and switched off the flashing patrol lights. The sudden disappearance of red and blue across the neighborhood changed everything. The street looked normal again, quiet again, human again. Naomi stood still for a moment, almost letting herself absorb the silence after nearly an hour of tension pressing against her chest. Without the police lights spinning across her house, it finally looked like home again instead of a place she had been forced to defend. Holloway stepped back from the driveway slowly, water dripping from the brim of his cap. "Miss Carter," he said carefully, "I truly am sorry." Naomi looked at him quietly. She could still feel the fear from earlier sitting somewhere deep beneath her ribs, but exhaustion had replaced anger now. She nodded once, not because the night had been erased, but because carrying bitterness after a 14-hour hospital shift felt heavier than she could afford. "Good night, officer," she answered softly. Holloway hesitated before giving a small respectful nod in return. Then he turned toward Marcus. "And thank you," he said quietly. Marcus simply glanced toward him without changing expression. "Just do better next time." Holloway swallowed once and nodded again. This time there was no defensiveness left in him, only reflection. He walked back toward the patrol SUV, opened the driver's side door, then paused one final time before looking at Naomi's house again. The porch light glowed warmly against the wet brick walls while rainwater dripped from the flower beds lining the walkway. The same house he had doubted only minutes earlier now looked painfully ordinary. A woman coming home from work. A driveway. A front door. Nothing suspicious at all. Holloway climbed inside the vehicle and slowly pulled away from the curb. The headlights disappeared down the street until only darkness and soft rain remained behind. One by one, the nearby curtains closed. Porch lights shut off. The neighborhood returned to sleep as though the night itself wanted to forget what had happened. Naomi let out a long breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her shoulders sagged from emotional exhaustion more than physical fatigue now. Marcus looked toward the spilled food container still lying near the driveway. Without saying anything, he bent down and picked it up carefully before carrying it toward the trash bin near the garage. Titan followed beside him silently. Naomi watched the small act with tired eyes. No speeches, no dramatic moment, just quiet kindness. Marcus returned a few seconds later, wiping rainwater from his hands. "You should get inside before you catch cold," he said gently. Naomi looked down at the wrapped photograph in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Marcus shook his head slightly. "You did not need someone to save you tonight." Naomi looked up at him. "Maybe not," she admitted softly. "But I needed someone to stand there long enough for me to breathe." For the first time all night, Marcus smiled faintly. Not proud, just understanding. Titan moved closer and gently nudged Naomi's hand with his nose before sitting beside Marcus again. Naomi laughed quietly under her breath, the sound small but real. The kind of laugh that only appears after fear finally leaves the body. She reached down and scratched behind Titan's ears once before stepping toward her front porch. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the roof as she unlocked the front door with tired hands. Warm light spilled softly into the night from inside the house. Before stepping in, Naomi turned back one last time. Marcus stood beneath the streetlight with Titan beside him, both half-shadowed by the fading rain. Neither of them said anything else. They did not need to. Naomi gave a small, grateful nod before finally walking through her front door and closing it gently behind her. Outside, Marcus slipped his hands into his jacket pockets while Titan stayed close against his leg. Together, they walked slowly back across the quiet street beneath the pale yellow streetlights. The rain had almost stopped completely now. Only the sound of water dripping from trees remained in the silence.